In this video, we're going to recap on how we call a function. Now, we've already seen examples of how we call a function. We've used the print function and we've called it. We've used the input function and we've used the int function to convert a string to an integer. But here I just want to talk a little bit more about calling functions. And I'm going to actually call a function that generates a random number. And Python has a module called random. Now you can think of a module being sort of like a book of functions. It's like this file that contains a bunch of functions that you can use. But before you can use any of the functions in this module or in this file, you first have to let Python know that you intend to use it. And you ask Python to sort of import it into your program so that you can use it. And that's exactly what I'm doing here in line 5. I'm asking Python, will you import the module random? And Python is clever enough to know where the module random is, where the file is, and then all of the functions within the module random can be used within this program that I'm writing. Line 15, I'm calling a function called random inside in a module called random. Now this is a little bit, might be a little bit confusing because this is the name of the function and this is the name of the module here. So it just so happens in this particular example that the name of the function I'm calling is the same name as the module the function is in. We'll see in a moment I'll be calling a function that has a different name than the module it is in. So I know, because I've read the documentation, I know that there is a function inside in the random module called random. And what it does is it generates a random number between 0 and 1. It's actually between 0 and 0.99999. It doesn't. It's not inclusive of 1. So it generates a random number between 0 and 1. So in order to call this function, I have to specify the name of the module and then the name of the function. So please call the random function inside in the random module. And I always specify brackets. I'll always have normal brackets after the name of the function. Sometimes there will be there will be variables or content within the normal brackets, and sometimes there won't. In this particular case, there is nothing between the brackets, but you always have brackets when you're calling a function. So I'm calling the function random. I'm not giving the function anything, and it's giving me back a random number. So because it's giving me back a random number, I better store this random number that it's giving me back somewhere. So I've created a variable called some number. Remember, a variable is like a box, and inside in that variable, I'm going to store the random number that the random function is going to give back to me. And then I'm just going to print it out so that I can see it. Again, I'm using a formatted string. So I print out, I just generated a random number between 0 and 1 exclusive. That means it's never going to be 1. So it's going to be less than 1. And then I use the formatted string notation of curly brackets, the name of the variable, and then close the curly brackets. So this, what Python will actually do is print out the value of the variable some number. So we'll see that coming out. Then in line 22, I'm just giving you another example of calling another function. At this time, I'm calling the function randint to generate a random integer. But this function takes in two pieces of information. So it takes in two numbers. And it's the range within which you want the random integers the random integer generated. So I'm saying, I'm asking Python, will you please generate a random number for me, a random integer for me, between the numbers 10 and 20. So I pass in the starting sort of the range and the end of the range. So these two pieces of information that I pass in are known as arguments. So a programmer would say, I am calling the randint function and I'm passing it two arguments, 10 and 20. And that's how you give things to functions. You pass in arguments. Programmers would also say that the randint function has two parameters. So it has two parameters and you give it two arguments. Some programmers interchange the word parameter and argument, and it can be a little bit confusing. But people will understand what you mean if you were to say the randint function has 2 parameters or the randint function has 2 arguments. But technically speaking, the more correct version is you would say the randint function has 2 parameters, but you give it 2 arguments. Okay, so I've called the randint function and I'm passing it, I'm giving it 2 arguments. The first argument is the number 10 and the second argument is the number 20. And this randint function is inside in the random module. Python will go ahead and generate a random number between those 2 numbers, between 10 and 20 for me, and I'm going to store them. I'll create a variable called some number. Actually, I've already created it up here, and some number is currently storing a number between 0 and 1. I'm now going to change that number to be a number between 10 and 20. And then I print it out. I just generated a random number between 10 and 20. And again, I'm using a formatted string. And then here's another example. So I've got, here I passed in the actual values. These are called literals. These are the actual value of something. Here I'm doing almost the exact, actually I am doing the exact same thing. But rather than pass in the literal value, I'm storing the literal value in a variable and passing in the variable into the function. So I'm creating 2 variables, one called low number, one called high number, put low number equal to 10, high number equal to 20. And off I go again in line 31 and I'm calling the randint function again. Just another example. This time I'm passing it in the arguments, 2 arguments yet again, but the arguments are now stored within variables. They're not literal arguments. I'm not typing in the values directly. So I'm not putting in the number 10 and the number 20. I'm actually putting in 2 variables which contain the values. It's a small point, but just to note that you can, when you're calling functions, you don't have to put in literal values. You can put in variables that contain the value you want to pass into the function. So this here, line 31 here, will do exactly the same as line 22 here, exactly the same. And we should see the same result getting printed out here in line 32. So let's have a look at it and see what we get printed out. So I just generated a random number between 0 and 1 exclusive, and you can see it was 0.2384, so on and so forth. And then I just generated a random number between 10 and 20, and I got 13. And then the second one, which was in line 32, like I generated a random number in line 31 and I printed out in line 32, and I got a random number between 10 and 20 again. This time, however, the random number was different. It gives you back a different random number each time. This time the random number was 17. So that's how you call functions. And I was using the randint function and the random function just as a demonstration as to how you call functions. The random function and the randint function are really, really useful functions, especially if you're making a game, for example, because it can simulate, for example, the roll of a dice. You can just generate a random number between 0 and 6, or 1 and 6, I beg your pardon, and it would sort of simulate a dice roll for you, which can often be very useful when making a game.